Afternoon program. Okay, so we're going to turn now to something a little different, material culture. And I want to introduce our next speaker, Jim Mullins. You've probably seen his book for sale on provincial weapons and equipment and accoutrements, and so take a look at that when you get a chance. Jim Mullins is a native of Southwest Virginia and has worked for over 12 years at the Art Museum of Colonial Williamsburg, and is a published author, illustrator, exhibit designer, and lecturer. As I said, his publications include of sorts for Provincials, American Weapons of the French and Indian War, as well as numerous articles on 18th century firearms, the colonial frontier, and related material culture, particularly the Virginia Regiment. I am frequently emailing Jim and say, well, why is this? Or I found this document, what does that mean? And things like that. And he's a very generous person for people trying to learn on their own about whatever their interests are about the French and Indian War. And I particularly recommend that if anybody has an interest in Dutch muskets, that's your man right there. a little bit of a niche following there. But. So without further ado, let's welcome Jim Mullins.
Hello everyone, appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all about this. I do like Dutch muskets and I cannot lie. Just as a quick attaboy, this conference has been very well run. You all have done a great job with it, great questions, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all about the material culture of arms in Virginia and the French and Indian War. The book John mentioned would not be possible without John. He introduced me to Eric Goldstein in Colonial Williamsburg because I was asking obnoxious questions that nobody could answer. And I think that was kind of like a little bit of a science experiment, mixing an acid and a base to see what would happen. But thanks to John's introduction, Eric's been a lifelong friend and mentor, and just would like to reiterate that the kind of networking possible with stuff like this is very worthwhile. Do it. I know some of us may be somewhat on an introverted scale, but it pays great dividends, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to do this. So we're going to start with Washington's Peel portrait from 1772, most popular slide of the weekend. Without getting too much into an art history dissection of this, this is 1772. Washington has resigned in 58. Some interesting stuff going on in this portrait, some of which is obscured because of the landscape format of the mighty PowerPoints. But Washington has in his pocket a piece of paper that is labeled the Orders of March. He is in his Virginia Provincial regimentals, so that is a superfine blue suit, meaning extra nice, high quality wool, scarlet and silver lace as ordered here in Winchester in 55 and 56 when he put out orders for his junior officers as far as how they were to equip themselves. One of the very interesting things, at least to me, a gun guy, material culture guy, is kind of really hard to see, especially in this format, but there is a munitions grade, either musket or fairly low-end fusee that is very awkwardly kind of positioned behind Washington to his left. Again, without getting into the art history weeds here, I'd like to think that this is a not so subtle way of him saying, I'm a veteran, I fought, I saw actual violence in combat, and I'm putting that behind me for now. Probably not for now in 1772, probably thinking he was putting it away forever. But anyway, let's launch on in here. All right, so again, all GW all the time. Great quote that kind of frames where we are as far as the province of Virginia at this point. And by this point, I mean prior to the French and Indian War. Virginia is a country young in war, and till the breaking out of these disturbances, has remained in the most profound and tranquil peace, never studying war nor warfare. It is not, therefore, to be imagined that she can fall into proper measures at once. Of course, that's to John Campbell Darrell Loudon in January '57. So, obviously, Washington is very strongly glossing over Virginia's very bloody 17th century interactions with Indian populations locally, but he is saying the truth. Unlike colonies to the north and south of us, Virginia has enjoyed, in the 18th century, a very long period of prolonged peace and a lack of warfare in close proximity to it. Certainly we are sending off men in British regiments raised here. War is a constant in the 18th century, but we have no Tuscarora War. We are not going to Louisburg every 5 months to knock on the door and see if we can get shot at. So things are a lot different in New England. Things are a lot different in the Carolinas for significant portions of the 18th century. So we've got this long-standing period of peace. Basically, the way the Tower of London worked with colonies was the further away you are from England and Europe, the worse the arms tended to be that were sent you. So Virginia, going back to the time of Jamestown being the capital, frequently received second and third tier arms, very worn out stuff, and because Virginia has no pressing need and no one really pressing the flesh in London to get newer high quality stuff, the dawn of the 18th century finds Virginia with a lot of leavings, leftovers, and old rusty stuff left over from the 17th century. And when there are shipments early on in that period, they're generally outdated second-hand goods, or in some cases third-hand goods. Alexander Spotswood does make a thrust at altering the defensive capabilities of the colony. He is in part responsible for the building of the Williamsburg powder magazine there. Evidently that brick wall is a little too high. That's currently getting a little facelift due to new research at Williamsburg. So the powder magazine not only housed gunpowder, traditionally in casks down in copper hoops to inhibit sparking, but also things like carbines, muskets, drums, tents, all the various and sundry field gear that is necessary for the militia battalions of the colony. Spotswood also sent off to England fairly early on for 600 stands of arms. Half of them were to be marked on the barrels for Spotsylvania County, half for Brunswick, and delivery times were a little over 10 years. So even though he's making efforts to bolster our ability to defend ourselves, things are not always in great trim. So some of the, just as an example, these swords, the one on the left hand came out of the governor's palace when that was excavated. These are brass-hilted small swords of a type that's probably around the turn of the century. These are still kicking around in the magazine in 1775. There's an inventory at the beginning of the Revolution that lists small swords. That's what these are. These are a small sword form hanger, but munitions grade, junk that an infantry soldier would have carried during the first quarter of the 18th century. These are actually in service through the Revolution. The Society of Cincinnati has one of these with a Virginia Rebel War officer ID to have used it. So this is the kind of thing we have prior to the Revolution. The Tower will send over outdated arms, but if you want the latest and greatest and new stuff, you've got to spend your own money unless there is currently a war and the winds of politics are blowing in your general direction. So Virginia in 1749 turns to the English gun trade to provide them with some suitable militia muskets. It's been decades since anything was sent over. As a white male within the age brackets, you were legally obligated to provide yourself with arms for your militia service. Depending on the quality officer and his attention to detail, some of these counties have very low turnout with functional firearms, much less powder, ammunition, cutting swords, the things that they're supposed to have by law. So Virginia turns to the English gun trade in 1749. We like to think of gunsmiths, especially say here in Winchester, we like to think of say Adam Haymaker in his small shop making every piece lock, stock, and barrel by himself, and that's just not how the economies of scale worked in the period. Specialization is king, especially in the giant world of English gun production. So you've got kind of a weird pseudo-cottage, pseudo-factory system. In Birmingham, there are neighborhoods where people specialize in filing locks. If you were a large gun maker, say farmer, you would have contracts with someone who would cast baskets and baskets of gun furniture. He would bring you those castings. You might have a neighborhood where you may be related to them through marriage, where there are guys who grind barrels all day. In some instances, these firms get big enough to where they do everything in-house, but the Tower of London, the ordnance system doesn't even really work like that. They farm out lock and barrel contracts. Those come to the tower to be inspected. There are woodworkers who are called rough stockers, who produce a rough stock, literally just that kind of sawn beginning stages. All of these parts are commingled at the tower by men called setters up, which is obviously super creative. But the setters up basically get this kit of approved parts, and that's how the British ordnance system works. Then there are a series of inspections. The commercial gun trade works in somewhat of a similar fashion. In some cases, you do have individual gunsmiths who are on a smaller scale, working on smaller contracts, doing most of the stuff in-house. But you kind of have this weird cottage neighborhood thing, push and pull with segmented production coming out of different areas in both Birmingham and London. So, in 1749, the colony pays for 500 stands of arms to be marked Virginia 1750 on the barrel. These are the arms that end up being carried to Fort Necessity. There really is a giant black hole of documentation about proper firearms for a very long period of time prior to this order. It's more than likely really old, creaky, rusty stuff is rotting in the magazine until these arrive. Now, we do not have a complete specimen, to my knowledge, that survives from these 500 stands. And by stands, I mean you have a musket, a sling, a bayonet, a cartouche or belly box that will hold 9, 12, 18, or 24 rounds, a waist belt, and then a frog for your bayonet scabbard. So that's a complete set. That is what we get from the Tower of London. That's what you get when you, those are the basic building blocks of all the equipment you need to fire as an infantryman in the 18th century. So 500 stands of these. The gun at top is actually from the city of York. That's a 1745 gun by Watkin. It's basically a brown mess. There are a couple of cost-saving measures, but it looks very similar to the contemporary English infantry musket. The markings, how it's been produced, and some of the finishing details vary slightly, but for all intents and purposes, it is a commercially manufactured brown vest. So, I mentioned we don't have one of these. We have a barrel, and my apologies for the low quality of the picture, but this is that barrel, and that image of Virginia 1750 is on the barrel there that's been used in a very lovely, naive kind of Kentucky Fallon piece that came out of West Virginia a few years ago. Again, my apologies for the quality of the pictures, but we can learn a lot from this silly barrel. The markings on the breech indicate that it received private tower proofing. That's the GR mark there. The initials FG are the barrel maker's marks above and below the proof mark. F and G stands for Farmer and Galton, one of the larger firms in mid-18th century England. They produced a ton of guns, literally a ton of guns for the African trade. They have ordnance contracts. If you were a gunsmith in England, you get paid well for doing stuff for the tower. Their standards are high. The quick and dirty work is for the African export trade or the Indian trade in America. You are doing some domestic stuff. If Lord Winterbottom needs a new silver-mounted fusee, you will have the occasional local customer. But for the most part, these larger firms are doing export or ordnance work in the period. So this was not a Tower musket, not marked as such, but this is a commercial copy of the same. And one of the interesting things about these being marked Virginia 1750 is that pops up again later. Here in Winchester in 1757, after bleeding lots and lots and lots of gear, clothing, and things that weren't soldiers' property that belonged to the colony or the king, Washington ordered his officers to basically shake down every tavern, tippling house, and places where soldiers gathered where they were not supposed to in Winchester. And one of the things in the itemized inventory in the Washington papers of what they found, including exciting things like ammunition stockings, literally someone sold his socks for alcohol, is a barrel only at the Widow Fitzpatrick's. So I can just picture someone kind of sneaking off, like, how much can I get for this? And that is literally the kind of stuff that's going on in this town. So everyone who could sell a dram had this captive thirsty audience who were at times not equipped with money or good credit. So gun parts even got legs and ended up in tippling houses here in town. All right, so we know what these are. We have a pretty good idea. I'm hoping one day a complete specimen will show up. This is the gun of Fort Necessity. This is what the initial Virginia regiment used at the Great Meadows. As was mentioned earlier, they were given the honors of war, and they were allowed to march off with their small arms and a single signal gun. A single swivel gun. These Virginia 1750 muskets kind of disappear. Obviously, this one was in use well after 1830 because it's been percussioned, or at least this barrel. There is a great inventory in 57 of the fort down near my way, Fort Boss, the second iteration of that. And one of the men states that he still has the musket that he had in Great Meadows, and he considers it his own now, so it was not to be included in the colony's inventory of stores there. So this guy's biography needs to be fleshed out. This guy saw a lot of stuff. So that's the Virginia 1750 guns. They were not all used up at necessity. It's not like the French took control of all those arms. The men were marching off with theirs, but Virginia's ability to fight an offensive war is heavily depleted, much less the slapdash defense that they're throwing together prior to the Braddock expedition. So to qualify Virginia, to arm her for the provincial component of the Braddock expedition, a new series of munitions were sent over from the Tower. Braddock's regiments are newly armed with long-land muskets of the King's pattern with steel rammers. That's the new high-tech thing. If you've ever had the opportunity to ram a live cartridge with a very lightweight ash rammer, as would have been in the period, there's not a lot of oomph there. They break easily when used. Braddock brought hundreds of spare ash ram rods as part of his ordnance stores to come over here. So the 44th and 48th got high-speed steel rammers. The Provincials always get second and third tier arms, but in this case, we got Dutch muskets. So these things highly underrated. I feel like I'm selling timeshares here on that. One of the things that was very puzzling when I first started down this rabbit hole was just, it's not hard to find references in primary sources to guns if you're trying to figure out what they actually used and carried. But every last one of them is very vague. You get arms, you get muskets, you get firearms. No one ever tells you what they are. In this case, that's a transcripted extract. We hit the mother lode in that they say these arms, that this is part of a shipment of 3,000, including 1,000 from North Carolina. In the Tower of London, a number of Dutch muskets bought in 1741 of a pattern quite different to that in use in the British Army. So that's a great clue. It tells us that these are not round vest shaped. We know that they're obviously the same bore. They can use the same fixed ammunition, but we have a date. That's also very helpful because in 1741, the British did have in Liège copies of the brown vests, which are very rare and only show up in a couple of places, but that's a nice definitive. These are made in Holland. We know when they were purchased. They are not round vessels. So, one of my favorite games is to look at dug bits from archaeological sites and figure out what they are. For instance, that lovely squished black shape there is the hilt from the figure of a cutlass. Complete examples in the bottom right that came out of, I believe, the armory in Williamsburg, Anderson shop. So we know these were Dutch. The Dutch are more of a confederation, provinces that get along, but there's not a strong federal system for their army at this point. There are about 20 different patterns of Dutch guns if you want to really split hairs. We don't know exactly what they are. We know they're Dutch. We know they were purchased in 1741. Well, through the magic of Doug's stuff, we can kind of figure out exactly which pattern these were. And these are 3 side plate fragments, one complete, all from areas that the Virginia Regiment, the Virginia Provincials, were garrisoned at. The top one is from Fort Chiswell in modern Wythe County. That is a home site that the Virginia Regiment under Byrd in 60 and 61 stayed at. The middle one is from here. That is from near the well at Fort Loudon. Some gun bits showed up several years ago, made the rounds on social media. That's a propped chunk of that. So that is about as local as it gets. How many blocks are we from the Loudon well?
About 5.
Okay, so that's the best I can do for you. 5 blocks away. And then the bottom piece is from Fort Ashby. So we'll page back here, and you can see that's a very distinctive side plate pattern. It could not be more Dutch. These guns in particular are currently being referred to as arsenal patterns. There's a lot of new research going on in by a fellow named Matthew Williamson in the Dutch National Military Museum that I'm very happy to work with. But one of the reasons we know these are not regimental muskets, meaning purchased by the colonels for their individual regiments, is they're not marked with any colonels' names. In the Williamsburg area, there's been a Dutch musket butt plate recovered with Colonel Verlier on it. We know when he was in the Dutch service. These also are frequently numerically marked, in some cases 800 or 900. There are no Dutch infantry regiments that have a component of men that high. So these are most likely municipal arsenal guns that were surplused out in the 1740s. Keep in mind, these get shipped over here in 1754, 55. They were purchased in 1741 by British authorities. These are old when they were purchased. So these are not top tier guns, and pretty much everybody that gets them, with the exception of North Carolina, complains about the quality. So these are second-rate, second-hand muskets, but we get a lot of them, and immediately Lieutenant Governor Dinwiddie is compelled to send several hundred to New York and New Jersey, who are also very unhappy with the quality of these arms. So this 2,000 shipment, 3,000 if you're including the 1,000 stands that are immediately distributed all through North Carolina, who are very bereft of arms, do have a large impact. Parts from these show up at Ticonderoga. So everywhere where New York and New Jersey provincials were early on, all that Lake George theater, these things are there. So this is fairly impactful, even if most of them require a little tinkering to get to fire correctly. So these are the Braddock arms. Locally, some of these are cut down from the Virginia Light Horse, which was a small mounting unit that accompanied Braddock. They also received sea service pistols because, again, we were kind of running short on everything here in the Old Dominion in 1754 and 1755. But these guns stick around and are here for a long time. 6th Virginia Orderly Book for the Revolutionary War specifically mentions the men who have Dutch bayonets. These have a bottom stud. They're distinctive and not the same as British bayonets. So these are old when they get here and are in use again well through the 1770s, even after the American revolutionaries received a large quantity of much better French arms. So these are the Braddock guns. We all know what happens there thanks to some of our earlier speakers. The Army collapses, Braddock is dead, Dunbar runs off, and Virginia is kind of left hanging out in the wind. Virginia goes on an immediate defensive posture, a small, hasty expedition against the Shawnee towns on Sandy Creek is poorly executed in the winter of 55-56, but in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of Braddock's army, Dinwiddie sends a bunch of letters out and is absolutely clamoring for more arms. Admiral Boscawen gives the colony an immediate, quick shipment of 400 sea service muskets. These are an emergency stopgap. These are sitting on British Navy vessels off of the Virginia coast. They're quick, they can get them to them, and we have the receipt from the accounting of that a year later from the Public Records Office in Kew. So we know exactly what these are because they are listed as Wright muskets. They're, just to make things more complicated, in the 18th century, the British Navy has Wright muskets and black muskets. Black muskets are not cut for bayonets. They are stocked from the muzzle. The barrels are finished black. The Wright muskets are finished in the white and feature bayonets. So Dinwiddie got bayonet equipped sea service muskets. At this point, it's almost exclusively the pattern 1738. These are very rare. The example there is at Colonial Williamsburg, I believe is currently on view. Their E-Museum has great pictures of it if you have an unfulfilled desire to learn more about the pattern 38 sea service musket, which I'm sure you all do at this point. All right, so we've gone from commercial muskets, not great Dutch muskets, an emergency infusion of sea service muskets, and the Virginia legislature really takes stock. Everything's a mess. The professional help that arrived has failed us. Things are in a disarray. The frontier line in Virginia is moving back further and further every day, basically the backcountry is being depopulated. And one of the things the Virginia legislature does is pass a law saying that the counties now, instead of just assuming that people will keep themselves armed because of the fine system that had obviously failed us, counties are now required by law to send off to England for a small complement of arms for their poorest residents. So we have several counties independently of themselves taking upon themselves to order muskets in Virginia in the period. We also have individual militia officers sometimes ordering a dozen guns for their company. These all vary in quality. One company commander who then had some of his arms impressed by Washington to arm his recruits had mentioned that some of the guns he purchased for his company individually were trading guns. And trading guns in this period are sheet brass furniture. They're the cheapest thing that goes bang. They're light, which is handy, but they also are very easily broken. So we've got a mixed bag of stuff coming in. That great musket there is marked Hanover County, Virginia, number 73, I believe. The lock is a working life replacement. It's a Dutch round-face lock that somebody's shoved on in there at some point. Another one of these recently popped up, and that piece of the lock is intact, and it's from a London maker called Sadlier. Nobody feels the French language or derivatives like I do, so just bear with me. If you're twitchy, it's just going to be a rough time for you. So we have some of these. We also know that these were still in use in the Revolution. A great ad from the Virginia Gazette from someone who lost a small musket or fusee marked for Dinwiddie County. So the counties are buying these. In some cases, individual militia officers are buying them. And the colony of Virginia also orders 600 more commercial muskets. Haven't been able to track down the source of those, but Dinwiddie, being famously, he's the reason we make fun of the Scotch in Virginia. He was very cheap, as was the Virginia legislature. he specifically mentions that the arms that are coming up were purchased not the Kings, but were purchased by the colony themselves. So we've got this mixed bag of commercial muskets. Generally speaking, they're not quite as nice and sturdy as the regulation ones. This particular musket has sheet brass ramrod thimbles versus cast. They just crush and dig up easier, but they're cheaper. So this is the kind of stuff that is now piecemeal coming into the colony and going to the Virginia Provincials here in Winchester at Fort Loudon. So then we get to 1756. William Shirley, we've also heard about quite a bit today, has received 10,000 stands of the best stuff. These are the best arms that come to North America for provincial use, and that's 10,000 stands of pattern 1742 muskets, wooden rammers. We're only getting steel rammers from British regulars at this point in North America. 1,000 of those go to the Virginia Provincials in 1756. This is the good stuff. We get them in Virginia, and Dinwiddie complains that it looks like they've been underwater for quite some time. So we're starting to kind of understand that the armorers that are willing away and cobbling stuff here at Fort Loudon are very, very busy men. So this is the best of times. The next gun we're going to talk about is the worst of times. And I was told that it was mandatory that I do some kind of movie tie-in. This is the gun that Johnny Depp should have used. Buccaneer muskets, not quite as cool as Dutch muskets, but they're pretty neat. So Buccaneer muskets were here in town. We used to have multiple inventories listing them as part of the armaments at Fort Loudon. Buccaneer muskets are this weird fossilized odd form. These started as Dutch geese guns in the 17th century. French freebooters, buccaneers had their own versions made by French gunsmiths. This is the gun. If you want to live in the Caribbean, shoot pigs, cover them in lime juice, not wear pants, this is the gun for you. That's literally the life of a buccaneer, and it's tempting. So Buccaneer muskets kind of have this much earlier stock architecture. They fossilized. They are initially very popular in the Caribbean, but in the first quarter of the 18th century, the African companies start sending them to various parts of the African coast where they are very, very popular. So different forms fossilized for the African trade, and Buccaneer muskets are also found over here. You see them in a few probate inventories in Virginia, more so in North Carolina. They're very popular in New England, as are Club American muskets, which kind of owe their lineage to this. So obviously the New Englanders are super steeped in the triangle trade. That's where these Guinea arms, these African trading forms come over. But this is one of the cheapest things that goes bang in the period. Much like Indian trading guns, these are actually generally worse because the North American Indian market required that they be proofed, which is an extra fee for the mechanics of doing that. Most of these are unproofed guns. Again, this is the fossilized 17th century goose gun, so they generally have very long barrels. 50, 52 inches is typical, whereas your British long-line muskets around 46. They're not quite as ungainly as they look. They're very light. They're made with various felt stocks. But we know these are in town. It'd be a great gun to stand on the top of a bastion and plug away at somebody with. They are handier than they look, but they're very long. They don't mount a man out. We also know some Virginia militiamen were armed with them. So we talked about that stuff. That's hyperlocal. This is, again, some items that were recently found near the well, the remains of Fort Loudon. We have some round best type hardware, some English King's pattern musket hardware. We've got an escutcheon and a portion of the trigger guard. Hard to tell whether those are commercial copies or regulation vests, but then we've got another one of these little chunks of a Dutch musket there. So that is, in a nutshell, the main thrust of what these men were armed with. Down in Southwest Virginia, in 76 and 77, there was a salvage dig before the highway obliterated most of the Fort Chiswell site. Again, this is Byrd's command after Washington is no longer with the Virginia Regiment. And we have what is probably a commercial brown vest copy that was highly likely broken when it was set in Alexander Sayers' 4-foot square smokehouse and burned. I'm assuming it was broken through the wrist, but we know it's more than likely a commercial gun because there is number 11 or number 15 is on the butt plate scutcheon in the bottom left there. The numbering system is not consistent with how British guns were generally numbered up by units. All right, so why does it matter? And who is this fellow? We've flashed forward to a different Washington. We still got guns and cool stuff in this photo, in this painting, but a lot's changed. Why does the French Indian War matter? Well, these two pieces of material culture here, these two images go a long way to explaining that. The bottom left thing that looks like a piece of gnawed tree bark is the bottom half of a Dutch musket trigger guard that came out of Fort Mullins in Ohio. So in 1778 or 1779, this was deposited. It actually has been sharpened on one edge. Somebody was using it as a hoof pick or back scratcher or something of that sort. Make up your own utilitarian use. But it's been a repurposed one, probably dropped by a Virginia or Pennsylvania soldier at Fort Mullins. So these arms that we get during the French Indian War are the original teeth that the Continental Army has in 1775 and 76. A very large swath of the officer corps for the American Revolutionary Army cut their teeth on military service in the French Indian War. Depending on which population estimate you look at, the British ordnance, not including weird things like buccaneer muskets, Fallon pieces, sent over approximately 1 musket for every 30 militiamen, everybody white male, in this 10-year or so period. That's a lot of guns. So there is a giant pile of military ordnance, artillery, and small arms that come over here from the French and Indian War. They're still in use by the revolutionaries. Of course, everybody's favorite thing. All this was very expensive. We had a lot of taxes we didn't like to pay for our own defense. The only other thing I want to do, I'm going to get into the Shepherd's Crook here soon. The French and Indian War, because of Forbes's adoption of the protected advance, which was also copied by Byrd, you're building military road, you have forts every now and then. These forts provide security and stability in frontier areas that were too violent for people to live in before they were there. Where there are forts, there's a market, and there are settlers and merchants. These become kernels of towns, and westward expansion is, there's a lot of gas thrown on the fire by these military roads and military forts, and that is a huge deal, especially once all these French and Indian War veterans want their land bounty land out where these forts were, where they saw great farmland. All right. Thank you all very much.
All right, do we have any questions for Jim? Yes, sir.
In the colony of Connecticut, we used the Dutch muskets, and the locks were breaking, the prisms were too soft, they wouldn't flint. Cartridge holes in the boxes they were sending were too small for the cartridges, so leather didn't come. Anyway, Connecticut, throughout the war, is repairing French captured muskets, using. In 1760, there's notations for Lion Regiment that they're cutting down French musket barrels to replace fusees for sergeants and officers. Did Virginia have anything like that, or use French muskets?
There's a couple of very brief instances where it may have been Adam Stephen, it may have been one of the Lewises. There are a couple of documented instances where Virginia Provincials purchased basically war booty French fusees, but I think that in all of those cases, they were purchased by officers as a novelty. So
And that was later in the war, later?
no, these are small parties that I think I can pull the reference, I've got it in text now, but I think a small party was captured near Fort Cumberland, and that's where those came from. Not a lot of French material culture making its way here versus the giant piles you have in New England, because they're hitting Louisburg every 5 years. Yes, sir.
And any idea what the relative cost was of these muskets, like Dinwiddie was buying commercially, and is it like a person's average daily wage, weekly wage, monthly wage, and how much of an impact was it on their budget?
So if you're a provincial soldier, you're making 8 cents a day, but your pay's getting docked for your food and your clothes. One of the problems with recruiting for the Virginia Provincials was that it was too low. You could make that in a much easier environment, not subject to the articles of war, getting shot in the face as a laborer everywhere else. I off the top of my head cannot tell you how much. I can get that info, but these are significantly more than that. So a cheap Indian trade gun is 15 shillings. You're getting 8 pence a day as a soldier, and that's the cheapest thing that can go bang. The muskets are, depending on which currency you're talking to, I want to say 3 to 5 pounds for new good
So
stuff.
that's a significant amount.
Very much so, yes. So that's a big deal when you're taking a random barrel you found laying around to the Widow Fitzpatrick's and getting run for it. All right, any other questions? Yes, sir.
The stand arms that decorated the reception of the governor's mansion, were they put into service?
Yes, in fact, we're foreshadowing a portion of Glenn Williams' lecture that'll be coming up later. The nicest stuff went to the governor's palace, which makes sense because it's decorative. You don't want to put the, Byrd, who's in command of this, the 2nd Virginia Regiment for the one campaign, that there are 2 regiments, complains that the arms he received have been below in the magazine since the reign of King William. The problem is the magazine isn't that old. So he's exaggerating a little bit, and that's the stuff that's being cobbled together here in Winchester. But the nicest stuff filters to the governor's wall. In 1774, when Dunmore comes here, he actually has a complement of, I want to say 300 stands that are mainly out of the governor's palace, packed up and sent up here. So the magazine's not getting the TLC that the stuff of the governor's palace is getting, and that's where the nicer ones are. All right, any other questions? No, somebody's glad for punishment. Yes, sir.
What were the calibers of the respective muskets you talked about?
Everything's English musket bore. So go-no gauges are roughly 3/4 inch bore, but really about 8/10 of an inch. All right. You all have suffered enough. Yes, sir.
Does the phrase lock, stock, and barrel pertain to this era?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, well, if anyone has any issues with insomnia or anything, you can find me out back. Thank you for your time and attention.
Okay, let's come back at 2:30, please.